And again, thank you for joining us, and I will now turn it over to today's presenters.
There we go. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for some of you. Abby, I'm trying to forward the slide. Perhaps, Abby, if you'll just forward the slide, then we won't have to worry about it. So when we always want to open these sessions, particularly when we are thinking about the impacts of traumatic events in our lives. So we want to open in a good way. And we have used Joy Harjo's Eagle poem as we settle in. Perhaps some of us, it's after lunch. Perhaps some of us are getting ready to go to lunch. But to think about and open ourselves up to hearing through with good ears and allowing the safety of the Creator Spirit to help us as we hear maybe some hard things so that we can integrate them into our knowledge and into our practice with youth. So we want to pray you open your whole self to sky, to earth, to sun, to moon, to one whole voice that is you, and the voice that you'll use as an advocate for youth, or if you are youth, that you will speak to past generations and future generations the wellness and the wholesomeness and the resilience of your people. Next slide. So good morning, everyone. I apologize. I have the camera on my laptop does not work. And because this Unsi, this granny is not technically savvy like the group on the last session, I couldn't figure out how to get my photo up in place of where my name is on this Zoom meeting. So I'm Marilyn Brewer Zimmerman. I'm a citizen of the Nakota and Dakota people from the Fort Peck, Assiniboine and Sioux Reservation in the northeast corner of Montana. I'm an Ojibwe descendant and a Nawa descendant, and I currently serve as the Senior Director of Policy and Programs at the National Native Children's Trauma Center.
So Marilyn, I'll jump in and introduce myself too before you go on with your presentation. My name is Debra Klemann. I'm a licensed clinical professional counselor in Montana, and I'm the clinical consultant for the National Native Children's Trauma Center. I commute to the University of Montana, where the National Native Children's Trauma Center is housed, and live in Kalispell, Montana. In a beautiful area. I took a little snapshot of a view just outside of my neighborhood, climbing a mountain and looking over Foy's Lake. I'm happy to be here with you all today.
Thanks, Deb. Next slide. So we're going to continue the training called Think Trauma, a training of working with justice-involved youth that was developed by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And we're using an adapted version of this training manual. We've adapted it for tribal communities and tribal juvenile justice serving systems. Next slide. So there are 4 modules in this training, and we wanted to let you all know that this is just a taste of a really much more in-depth 1 to 2 day training that we can provide for you in your communities, hopefully, in the next 3 to 6 months when we hopefully get to start to travel again. And so we will be covering Module 3 and Module 4, Trauma and Context in Coping, and Trauma and Staff Wellness. Next slide. So I also want to mention that if you had any questions from yesterday's presentation from part 1, or if at the end of this session there wasn't time to get to your question, we are going to have a panel of our staff on Friday, and you can hold the questions till then if we don't get to them today, or if they didn't get to them yesterday, and we'll be able to hopefully suss out some of the questions and some of the context with which you needed more clarification. All right, so we're going to be thinking about coping. Want to welcome you back to this module. We want to build on the work that you did yesterday in going through modules 1 and 2, and hopefully give you a deeper understanding of some of the family or societal contexts that many youth lead to youth's coping behavior. Sometimes that's helpful coping skills, sometimes not so helpful, but they're all meant to help support them as they deal with their trauma. Next slide. So today's learning objectives, my section will talk about the impact of traumatic events, very brief overview, again, just a reminder of the adverse childhood experiences on just not youth's well-being, but their expectations from the world. There's this notion of a social contract that children develop with their caregiving system or the other systems that serve them as children. And when that trust is broken, it takes quite a bit to rebuild that trust. So we're going to talk about the challenges that youth face with their social contract, with some of the biases, and particularly the systems that they have to navigate because of the traumatic events that have occurred in their life. Hopefully, we'll be able to identify just a few maladaptive strategies that they may use, and understanding them as survival coping strategies. It has helped in the past to help them stay alive and stay present, but now maybe those same strategies aren't quite as helpful. And so we look to support them in discovering and providing for themselves positive alternatives to how they've been coping in the past. And then we're going to identify and practice some components of what we call a trauma-informed safety plan, and use that knowledge to support the youth's safe behavior. They drive the development of the safety plan. They talk about what they find supportive, what they're willing to do to support themselves when they become triggered. Next slide. So we're going to watch a portion of this video, and this follows the story of a young man named Manny, and you see parts of his current life and parts of his childhood that have been really challenging, where he has experienced traumatic experiences. And you'll also see that he may not have had the support that he needed. He may be misdiagnosed, so to speak. You'll be able to see what items or look for as you're watching this, some of the triggers that Manny may feel or experience, and how his only support system was helpful or not. And then looking at thinking about those institutions or providers, such as those within school, law enforcement, probation settings, how they're either helpful or not helpful, and how they either trigger or support Manny. But I want to give and acknowledge a disclaimer before playing this film. It's inspired by a true story. It shows various ways that trauma can impact youth. It does contain adult language, and include scenes with family violence, which may be upsetting to watch. So it's going to be important to go to that healing room if you find it too upsetting for yourselves. People who have experienced trauma or institutionalized racism or sexism and other forms of oppression may be uniquely impacted by the content of this film. So feel free to step aside also, go into a different room, take a break, get some water, whatever it is that you need to support yourself. But as you're watching this, and if you work with youth directly or you're part of a system that supports those youth, there's always that one kid that we all remember, that one youth that we all remember that taught us so much. they probably were the most challenging, but they certainly taught us so much. So either lean into Manny's experience or think of a youth in your own community, in your own experience that maybe correlates with what Manny's gone through. All right, play video, please.
Report to the judge.
Who are you texting?
Texting a friend. What do you care?
Let me see your phone.
I'm not gonna let you see my phone. It's my phone.
I don't want to violate you, Manny, but this doesn't look good. What were you thinking?
It's not as simple as just like a person.
Are you stupid or something? Let me see your phone.
Yo, Mario, what's up?
Come here.
Hey, man, why don't you leave her alone?
I was thinking, I gotta do something.
Well, you sure did something.
Hey, she doesn't want to talk to you, man. She doesn't want to talk to you, man.
What are you gonna do about it, huh?
Oh my God! No! Stop it!
Leave me alone, man.
No! Stop it! Stop it!
Are you using again?
No.
Is that what your drug test is going to tell me?
Yes.
I've known you for a while, and I believe you're a good kid, but your anger could be your undoing. So you've got to do something about that.
It's not as bad as it looks.
You told me this wouldn't happen again.
I know.
Did you get busted again?
No, it's all good. Don't worry about it, babe.
I told you. I don't want my baby around anyone who's violent.
It was just something stupid. I don't even know what happened. I would never hurt our baby.
How am I supposed to trust you? You just broke the one promise you made me. You know I don't want him to grow up with parents like ours.
What are you talking about? You had it easier than I did.
I'm serious.
I'm sorry. Look, all I'm saying is that I'm not like your old man, okay? I can be in control. Can I hold my baby now, please?
Go clean yourself up. I don't want blood on our baby. Manny, bring out a new diaper when you're done.
Manny! Give me some water! Hear me talking to you, boy? I said give me some water! Hurry up!
Manny, diapers, please.
Don't make me get up! Hurry up! It's always something with you! What are you stupid? Huh? You retard! It's always something with you! I don't want that kid anyway! I fucking told you!
Manny, did you hear me?
Hey, bud. Seems like you've been having a hard time. Do you want to talk about why you've been getting in fights? Not getting along with the other kids in your class? How's school, Manny? Good. It's good. Did you do anything fun? No. Is that boy still picking on you? No. Good. Did you tell him who's boss? Manny, wait up! You have to stay close.
Manny! What's up, man? What's good, bro?
Those boys are idiots. Don't hang out with them.
Also, I've heard that you've been having trouble paying attention. Focusing on your work? Would you be willing to tell me what's bothering you?
Hey, what's good, Manny? What's going on, my man? How's it going? How you doing, man?
Leave my brother alone.
Hey, girl, how you doing? Where you going? How you doing? Yeah, where you going, huh? Hanging out with my boy, Nick.
Manny. Manny, you're not in trouble, okay? I just want to know what's going on.
Fuck off! What the hell?
Where you going, huh? Where you going? What's up?
Oh my God! Manny!
Hello? Oh, hi. Yes, thank you so much for getting back to me. Yeah, so the reason we're recommending testing is we're kind of confused with what's going on. I mean, he's such a sweet kid, but he just seems to be having so much difficulty functioning. Yeah. Okay, I mean, he is hyperactive. His teacher keeps coming to me and, telling me about all of his learning problems. She seems to think that he has ADHD. But, at other times, he just seems to go off into another world. I'm just starting to wonder if it's maybe something developmentally. Yeah, but I mean, then there's other times when he just explodes and gets aggressive. I'm just starting to think that maybe given his family history that it may be some form of bipolar. Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time to get back to me. I hope this helps inform your testing. Okay. Thanks. Bye.
Look, I know you love your kid, and that's a beautiful thing. But you have to start working on making better choices if you want to keep on being the man of your house, and that's real talk.
Maybe I shouldn't even try anymore. Maybe they're better off without me. I'm just gonna screw up like I have my whole life.
Maybe you will, and maybe you won't. But you owe it to your son to try. He's going to be your age one day. And what do you want him to think when he looks back and remembers his dad?
Abby, because of time, let's stop the video here. Thank you. So that was really hard to watch for some of us, and I apologize that we don't have the time and the space to really debrief about this film, but what's important is that we see sort of the suitcase or the baggage that Manny carries with him from childhood, from a violent father, from, you know, a household that felt like they were hostages, sister being assaulted, and those sorts of things. So it's important to remember that and to better understand the suitcase. So when we're thinking about and discussing coping, we have to remember that these are the kids that are in our systems, whether they're child welfare or they are they're in the juvenile justice. Next slide, please. I see 2 questions. Yes, you can have the link to the video. We'll get that to you. So, because it's a very good video, because finally he gets the right diagnosis. It's about adverse experiences. So when previous life experiences are rooted in traumatic events, like was happening with Manny, either caused by individuals or the institutions that were meant to help him, that they're supposed to protect him, they can develop some traumatic expectations that shape how they present themselves to the world and deal with challenges. When Manny answered the question, "What were you thinking?" He answered, "I was thinking, I got to do something," right? So he's finally old enough and big enough to be able to do something. So another is expectations about how the event might unfold. In this case, Manny believed that Mario yelling at his girlfriend at the beginning of the film would end in her being hit, basically based on his own childhood experiences. So this is where many of the youth with traumatic expectations often react to certain situations, and it really is outside their personal conscious awareness. Their reactions are often automatic, and they don't go, "Oh, well, I felt like I had to do something about it because of what I felt helpless in my household to do anything about my dad." So it can also trigger a person's feeling a sense of danger before and after the event. And for not having someone to talk with about their fears or anxieties, they begin to anticipate bad things are always going to be happening. It will further strengthen their belief that their life, as you heard Manny say, maybe they're better off without me. Their life might not be worth the try. So while Manny's reaction wasn't the only way to keep the girl safe, even how the situation would play out, his traumatic experience made him strongly believe that she was going to be hit. So we have to understand youth traumatic expectations or messages from others and society. And then thinking about just briefly his girlfriend, the mother of his baby, you know, just him calling out, "Manny, you know, bring a diaper when you come back out." It's innocuous to us, but to him, right, it triggered him. It took him right back to his dad making demands. Next slide. So the impact of complex traumatic experiences go far beyond how an individual believes. They can protect themselves from danger, and it often extends into and influences the expectations and beliefs about how they have to protect their family. And especially if, as we saw in the film, his mom was dealing with her own experiences of trauma, right? Because of the husband, but we don't know what kind of history she had. But we also don't understand what kind of history that his dad had. So they may be having traumatic stress reactions, and they're triggered and dysregulated. And dysregulated adults raise dysregulated children. So again, parents of untreated trauma, this is where we can do a lot in helping parents by understanding that some of their reactions may be trauma responses, and that's how we build alliances with them. But also the parents understanding that some of their reactions are based in fear and shame, and that they can change that, that we don't have to perpetuate that intergenerational trauma, and they can make better decisions about how to keep their children safe. I have one story of a young woman whose mother would yell at her and get mad at her whenever she wanted to go out after 10 o'clock. And So I'd known her quite a while, and she'd been my client a long time. And I said, so you know that her yelling is about fear? And she said, no, I didn't know that. And I said, yes, she fears for your safety. And she was like, well, I'm okay. And I said, so has any of your friends been raped at a house party? She's like, yeah. I said, does your mom have a history of being raped at a house party? Yeah, she told me about it. I said, so maybe when you want to go to a house party after 10 o'clock, it triggers her fear. And the only way she knows how to try to convince you to stay home is to yell at you. So just understanding that parental impacts of intergenerational trauma on the parents themselves, but on the youth. Next slide. So again, reminding ourselves that it's those institutions, whether it's schools or justice systems or child welfare systems, that really have basically broken the social contract for these kids. So a distrust of social contract is a belief that the systems and the institutions that are meant to protect us, including our parents, are supposed to protect us, but they have no ability to. And sometimes those systems are actually actively doing harm to those youth, right? Without realizing it very often. So this can lead to an automatic distrust and sometimes opposition to people who represent certain institutions. You know you're well-intended. You know you've got the best interests of your youth at the core of who you are, but they are not convinced. The social contract has been broken and now by someone, and now it's up to us to help rebuild that trust. Next slide. Won't go too much into trauma and ACEs. You've heard about the study earlier. So just looking at above the ground, the tree, I was looking at some of those household and childhood experiences that we experience in the context of our caregiving system, whether it's a mom who's depressed, a dad who suffers from mental illness, maybe they're incarcerated, maybe you experience homelessness, maybe you witness domestic violence. What we also need to understand is that the root of a lot of the events that happen in a family's life are because of those community environments, poverty being a real stressor. So I always like to say that, poverty is not necessarily, we're not bad people or stupid people or lazy people. But what poverty does in the caregiving system is it not only depletes the financial resources of the caregiver, but it depletes their emotional, psychological, and spiritual resources. And there's not much left for parenting. People that have experienced discrimination live in poor housing. There's lack of opportunity or economic mobility, particularly in many of our rural reservation communities. So there's adverse community environments that can exacerbate those adverse childhood experiences. Next slide. Of course, we have to talk about historical trauma, understanding that it perhaps may be, from many researchers' perspective, the most detrimental might have been the removal of children for assimilation to placed in boarding schools, where they were pulled away from their warm, nurturing, wholesome parenting environment with their mothers and fathers and grandmas and grandpas and aunties and uncles and elders and community members, and instead raised in very punitive, harsh environment and returned home to begin to parent generations of children who didn't have the experience, didn't know what the cultural ways that parenting were, and treated their own children as harshly as they'd been treated in boarding school. Not on purpose, but thinking they were doing the best that they could for their children. Next slide. So there have been ACEs in Indian country. This is to just briefly talk about the original ACE study. 63% of those mostly white, middle-class, well-insured participants had experienced at least one ACE, whereas 86% of American Indian populations have experienced at least one ACE. And again, in the original study, 12.5 had 4 or more. We're walking 33% of us have 4 or more in our communities. Next slide. So I want to draw your attention to 288 youth ages 14 to 24 from the Northern Plains Reservation. 78% of those youth had an ACE, at least one ACE. 40% or reported multiples, and 37% reported 3 to 6 exposures. So we want to bring home that adverse experiences of our children and our parents and our families and our communities is very common and very high. Next slide. Click it one more time. Thank you. So here's where we want to go. We want to start thinking about engaging in trauma-informed approaches in the justice settings to really think about what kind of policies or procedures or practices that we're engaging in that we're inadvertently causing more traumatic experience for the youth. So it's really that system-induced trauma that occurs with good intention, but not helpful. So we're going to take a look at some of the ways that we're going to support our children in our programs by realizing how prevalent trauma is, recognizing what those behaviors mean, responding in a thoughtful, trauma-informed way, and hopefully creating an opportunity to resist re-traumatization. Next slide. Really want to call your attention to the link between ACEs and recidivism. So I think this really brings it home for us as we think about the youth that we're serving, and we're seeing repeat offenders. You can see on the bottom that the ACE score is 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, that the higher the ACE score, the more recidivism that people experience, that the youth experience. And so it's some of our programming is failing and kids are recidivating because they were not addressing their trauma. We're not addressing their trauma histories, their trauma experiences, and we're not accounting for the impact of those traumatic experiences in their lives as we're seeking to provide them support and care. Next slide. So let's talk about how we deal with stressful situations. I know that this feels like we're jumping forward, but again, in the interest of time, let's talk about what stressful situations are and what some of those experiences we might consider being stressful. So think about how you've dealt with stressful life experiences and consider what your coping strategies are. Like I know when I used to be a cigarette smoker, and if an emergency happened in the emergency room when I was into primary health care, after it was over, I would go out and have a cigarette, and I believed it calmed me down. It could be that I thought it was helpful. It wasn't good for my health. So thinking about what's healthy coping and what's not healthy coping. So first we'll look at the appraisal, reading the situations where the situation seems threatening, helping those youth appraise that situation without looking through the lens of being triggered. The second part is coping. What are our coping options? How do we tolerate or reduce or minimize? How do we support one another? What are some of the things that we can use that will work? And finally, how are we going to respond and actually deal with those stressful situations? How are we going to support the youth to figure out how to do that? That's what we're going to talk about next. Next slide. So it's important to understand that very often youth, while they're being triggered, obviously, there are reasons that they will not be able to employ those coping strategies in the moment. So we have to really make sure that we're practicing those coping skills with them when they're not triggered. So some of the invisible suitcases can distort how they see themselves and the filter they use, making sure we understand and acknowledge that and keep that always at the forefront of our mind. Acknowledging that coping strategies are very often aligned with their identity. Their social identities are tied to some of their traumas, but they're also tied to some of their coping strategies. Their identities like gender, LGBTQ, race, American Indian, right? Which tribe, how tribes, how we let class, the haves and the have-nots, even in even in our rural reservation communities, we know that socioeconomic status can be very wide. Religion, sexual orientation, all of those play a role in their social identity. So how do you connect with youth with their social identities can be tremendously impactful and impacted by that invisible suitcase. So understanding this is particularly important when youth have social identities connected to groups who've experienced that trauma, whether it's American Indians with historical trauma, or it's gang affiliation, or it's family affiliation. What does that look like? Okay, next slide. So a good piece of the conversation is to help to look at that youth and identify how they identify. What is their social identity? What are they, what religion? Are their parents Pentecostal, but they want to follow their tribal religion? Are they from a family that's very poor and very known to be very poor in the community? What kind of impact does that have with their peer relationships? Sexual orientation, how is that being played out in the community? That sort of thing. Next slide. So really, it's the understanding of social identity gives you a clue into their relationships and how they develop and define their relationships. So, so we have to understand that very often, in order to cope, we have to connect. We have to make those good connections with people. We have to make those good connections, healthy connections, in order to find support. And so that's a big piece of the conversation when you're working with youth, is being able to develop an authentic relationship with them, to help them develop beyond just survival coping. Next slide. So we're going to talk briefly in the last few minutes about a safety plan. In the resources, there should have been a packet with a safety plan. There was a miscommunication. So before April 30th, probably sometime after this conference, I will upload an example of the safety plan that is used in this Think Trauma curriculum. You don't have to use it, but it's very much about thinking about what those elements are of a safety plan that need to be included in. These are them. Next slide. We're going to talk briefly about each of them. So first, identifying the trauma history, right? And it's trauma history before detention, or before they come before you in courts, or when they come with you in probation. What's happened? Are they being bullied in school? Are they being pushed out of school? Are they witnessing domestic violence? Are they victims of violence themselves? And then what are some of the things that have happened within the context of detention or arrest? What has happened to them there? Finding out that history is going to be important. Next slide. So here is the first part of the trauma-informed individualized safety plan that you would do, and we would train you to do with the youth after you've developed a good relationship with them, because it's a conversation and it's the youth that identify. And they may not want to identify sexual abuse if they don't feel safe right now. If you haven't developed enough of the relationship, they may be willing to identify others. But a good trauma history is a first step in developing safety plan. Next slide. And then second, discovering those trauma reminders, right? So what does that look like for you and for the youth? If they're in detention, lights out at 9 o'clock, is darkness a trigger? People doing room checks, peeking in through those little windows to make sure they're in their little cells. Is that a trigger? What else could be a trigger? Watching, yelling or fighting, witnessing other youth fight. You don't have to be a part of the fight. Proximity, a youth gets too close, or a juvenile detention worker gets too close, or even that sense of loneliness. Parents don't show for visiting, right? Or they feel isolated alone because they're isolated from their peers, even within the context of detention. Next slide. So a third is determining the early warning signs in the context of the intergenerational or system-induced, or basically ACEs, or historical trauma. What's the context? So helping them identify right before you got really, really mad, did you find yourself clenching your fists, bouncing your leg? Were you pacing, right? Do you sleep less? Were you sweating? Do you start to breathe really hard? What are those things that physically happen to you when you're triggered that you don't realize? And now you help the youth to start pay attention to what those triggers might be, so that once they identify them, they can create strategies to support themselves. Next slide. So that's the big piece of taking time before they're triggered and helping them discover what helps them with their stressful situation, writing in a journal, talking to their friends, working out, listening to music, but whatever they can come up with to think about. And because of time, we won't go further. So next slide. Calming behaviors, using your senses. This is really important because it really is helpful. So being able to listen to music, being able to have a stress ball and squeeze and feel the squishiness of it can help calm irritated or aroused or angry or tired and help them relax. Taking a shower, watching snow, right? Smelling burning leaves might be calming. Smelling really pretty bath soaps might really be calming in a hot shower. Just lowering the lights in the office might be. And what's really helpful is that taste is what seems to really work with youth is those super hot fireballs that seems to calm them down and they're paying attention to their taste. Next slide. And here's how you would help them. This is the handout that would help you create that space with them and create those strategies that they would induce. And then you would practice with them so that when they got triggered, they would be able to engage in those helpful behaviors. Next slide. So this is the end of my portion. And it really is the process of becoming trauma informed is really collaborating with youth through your own humility. And when I say cultural humility, I'm not talking about tribal cultural humility. I'm talking about generational or gender or whatever, however it is that you come humbly into that relationship and bring self-awareness to help them engage in better self-control that leads to some positive coping, right? More positive coping strategies help reduce the incidence of their exposure to traumatic events. And it eventually can all lead to a more positive environment in your system and increase your job satisfaction. So that concludes my section. Do we have time for a question? I see a question.
Marilyn, the question was personal to you, so you may want to answer that. It wasn't.
Oh, okay. I see that.
There was one question, just wanted to double check, Marilyn, regarding where the participants can find the ACE screening tools. I believe you have them on your website, and there is a link on the Tribal Youth website as well. Just confirming that.
Yes. So yes, and I'll talk a little bit more, but just you can find our resources on our www.nnctc.org or on the www.tyrc.org or tribalyouth.org. Christy, I am at the University of Montana. Get a hold of me. All right, next slide.
Okay, hello everyone. It's Debra Klemann again, and this is where I'm able to take over. So the last 3 modules of our presentation have focused on trauma and youth. And now we're going to spend some time talking about your wellness. Those of us who are in the helping profession that find ourselves helping kids heal from trauma. We know that this work can be impactful. we really wanted to spend some time talking about how to manage your own wellness. And that's going to be the focus for the rest of the presentation. I'm going to go ahead and try to advance because I do believe I might get control over the screen. So I'll try one more time. And so Abby, I guess I would just ask you to advance the slide, please. So one of the overall goals of this module is to make the trauma-informed approach personal. As I'm going through the information, I'd really like for you to examine how you can apply it to yourself in your own wellness. We know that staff wellness is exceptionally important when it comes to taking care of others. We consider it to really be an ethical imperative for those in the helping profession. So at the end of this presentation, we're hoping that you might have your own plan on how to manage and reduce not only your personal stress, but how you can apply what you've learned today to your organization to promote wellness throughout the entire organization. Next slide, please. So one way to start promoting your own wellness is to really take a self-assessment as to how you're doing. In the chat box, I am going to post a link to the ProQual. That's short for the Professional Quality of Life Scale. This is a self-administered test and self-scored. It's simple. It only takes about 10 minutes. And it measures how you're doing on subscales. And those subscales are compassion, satisfaction. That's what excites you about your work. That's that joy you get from caring. The other subscale is burnout, which is the fatigue or the drain, weariness that we can get as a result of caring. The third subscale is a secondary traumatic stress. And secondary traumatic stress is that those symptoms that we can pick up from hearing about our clients' stories. And I'll have the opportunity to talk a little bit more about these subscales as we go on. But I'm really hoping that you might take that link and find the self-assessment that you can do. It is, and as Marilyn mentioned earlier, we'll be posting more resources before the April 30th deadline. So we'll also post a copy of the ProQual. Next slide, please.
Deb, we're getting some comments about the link.
Okay, so at the end of the presentation, I'll try to see if we could correct the link. You could also, it's quite easy to find it if that link doesn't work. If you do a search, Professional Quality of Life Scale, the first one that pops up on Google goes directly to the assessment that you could print off and self-administer and self-score. So let's talk about wellness and how it impacts work, right? In order to live whole and healthy lives, it's important to understand how to maintain wellness. So the Substance Abuse Mental Health Service Administration identifies 8 dimensions of wellness, okay? And these are listed on your screen. We know that staying healthy is really a very active process. And if we are in a position of feeling well, we're more likely to be connected to the compassion satisfaction. And the definition of compassion satisfaction is the pleasure you derive from being able to do your work well. So I'd like for everyone just to take a moment and look at the wheel that's on the Venn diagram, I guess, to be accurate, that's on the screen. Right? If we were to really look at these dimensions, what are some things that you do in each of the realms to take care of yourselves? So I'm going to come up with some ideas that I do, and I want you to be thinking about what you've been doing or maybe what you've done before that help you in these realms really take care of yourself. So for instance, physical self-care, that might look like, for me, getting enough rest, drinking enough water, okay? Doing things that get me moving and active. My favorite thing to do is kayak. What are some psychological self-care or some, thinking, thoughts, intellectual self-care? That might be, practicing a Sudoku, doing a Sudoku puzzle. It might be having stimulating conversations. Okay? When I think about what might spiritual self-care look like, that might really be a connection or relationship with nature, or maybe it's prayer. Or, how do we take care of ourselves socially? It might look like laughing with friends, or it could be contributing to a cause that you feel is worthwhile. We're going to talk a little bit more as the presentation goes on about occupational wellness. Financial wellness might look like budgeting so that at the end of the month, you're able to reward yourself with a new pair of jeans. So in order to make it personal, just as we're going through the presentation, I want you to have, just want you to be thinking about those things that you already do. And hey, maybe you could even do more of those things that really contribute to your wellness. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about wellness, we have to consider the yin and the yang, right? Oftentimes we have an understanding of what does help us feel better, but there are barriers that might keep us from doing these things. So similar to the impact of trauma on youth, trauma and related stressful events can have a cumulative impact on you and your workplace. Okay. So maybe you've had the opportunity of filling out the ACEs questionnaire, but there are a number of individual and organizational experiences that can create barriers to wellness. And maybe some of the barriers we have is trauma reminders from our own trauma. Maybe some of the barriers we have we'll find when we do the pro-qual, like maybe we're having some symptoms of burnout, or for some symptoms of STS, or maybe within the workplace, we're actually having some direct exposure to trauma, witnessing difficult events that are happening within the youth that we serve. And so what we're hoping to do for the rest of the presentation is to talk about how to combat some of these barriers. Next slide, please. If you could, take a minute and think about what are some of the types of potentially traumatic events that either you or your coworkers have experienced in the juvenile justice system. What have you experienced? What have you seen in your time? What have you heard your coworkers see? In 2009, the Juvenile Justice Treatment Committee conducted a survey of juvenile justice professionals from around the country with the following results. 92% of justice professionals have witnessed an act of violence or aggression by a youth directed at a staff member. 90% witnessed an act of violence or aggression by a youth directed at another youth, and 81% restrained a youth in their program. All of these are relatively common experiences in juvenile justice settings and can potentially result in direct exposure to trauma and create trauma reminders. Just like youth, we have trauma reminders from previous traumas that present themselves in the work setting as well. And then I would also add that additionally, it's important to highlight the role of traumatic grief and loss. When you personally experience a loss of someone, it can really disrupt your long-term, disrupt your life temporary and long-term, and might make it difficult to focus at work. So these are some of the direct traumas that some of you may have experienced, or some of your coworkers may have experienced within their tenure working with youth. Next slide, please. In addition to that direct trauma exposure, those of us in this line of work can also be exposed to secondary traumatic stress. So an understanding of secondary traumatic stress, if we know how to identify it, if we can be in tune with ourselves, with our coworkers, with those that we supervise, if we know how to identify it, we can implement policies, procedures to help combat STS. So secondary traumatic stress is defined as a trauma condition caused by indirect exposure that parallels the symptoms of PTSD. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about those risk factors. As we go through these, you might think about yourself. Sometimes we think we're doing really well, but if we really were to take a close look, it might be that we need some extra support. Okay, so be thinking about whether or not you might have some of these risk factors. So I'm also going to just talk briefly too about what might be ways of recognizing the impacts of secondary traumatic stress. So on the emotional or psychological aspect, like we might find ourselves distancing, right? We might tend to self-isolate. We might feel a little bit more depressed or anxious, a reduced ability to feel sympathy or empathy. We might be a little bit more jaded toward the world, so to speak. We might have some dread of working with certain cases or certain people, or we might try to avoid things that remind us of either our trauma or the trauma of some of our youth that we work with. On the physical level, you might be suffering from STS if you're really having problems sleeping, if you have headaches or other somatic complaints, back pain, abdominal pain, sometimes grinding of the teeth. These might be some indications that you could potentially be suffering from STS. And we know that the higher dose of exposure increases your risk. So the more exposure you have to trauma, the more at risk you are of secondary traumatic stress. A lot of us who come to this work have our own history of previous trauma, and that can increase our risk of developing STS. Support is important, and if we don't have support from our loved ones or from our organization, that can cause more, or that can cause us to be more at risk. And then also, just being new to the job, that adds to our sense of competency and how we're feeling. And then any type of tendency towards negative coping skills. So negative coping skills might be those survival type of coping skills like smoking or anxiety driven. Can everybody hear me okay? There's been some chat that there might not be sound.
Deb, the sound is fine on my end.
Okay, great, thank you. I just wanted to double check. Okay, so could we move to the next slide, please? And I guess I just wanted to add, as I was going through some of those signs and risk factors of STS, I want you to know that this presentation is about developing skills and strategies to overcome. It's also about building skills and strategies to overcome burnout. So when thinking about the impact of STS, it's important to notice some of the initial signs that you're feeling overwhelmed. And one of the biggest signs is burnout. So experiences that both inside and outside your job can contribute to burnout. All right? And burnout is a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion, often with feelings of hopelessness or difficulties dealing with work. So burnout is a little bit like losing your motivation or get up and go about going to work. It might be a little bit harder to dredge up that motivation and remember why it is you do the work you do. Next slide, please. So when we're in this state, like maybe we are suffering somewhat from STS or burnout, we can pack up our invisible suitcases with unhelpful ways of looking at the world, much like the youth that Marilyn described can build up their invisible suitcase with unhelpful ways of looking at the world. And that's called vicarious traumatization, right? It changes our inner experience, right? And it makes us think differently about the world. And when that happens, it's more difficult for us to gain satisfaction from work. You might have some suitcase thoughts of your own. So I want you to think about what might be in your suitcase. What are the ways your work has impacted how you see yourself, how you see the world, and how you see others? All right. So like an example might be before doing this work, one might think that people are inherently good. But as the work goes on, people might be a little bit more suspicious, or their default thought about people might be more negative. That would be an example of a suitcase thought. When we bring up suitcase thoughts, it certainly isn't to shame people for having them. You know, we're all robots, and so it's not a problem to have these thoughts. But it is a problem if we let these thoughts go unpacked. Right? And so part of that unpacking is identifying what they are. So next slide, please. So the most recent version of the DSM classifies ongoing STS exposure as a traumatic event that can lead to PTS type of symptoms. Right. These symptoms can be the same traumatic stress responses that we discussed earlier in modules 1 and 3 that affect youth. So specifically, frequent STS exposure coupled with direct exposure to trauma, burnout, and vicarious traumatization can constantly activate your survival brain, right? That's that more reactive part of our brains, and significantly impair your physical health, relationships, emotions, psychological health, and work performance. So I want you to just kind of think, you know, we talked a little bit about what some of those signs are of STS. So might you have some STS signs that are impacting you? Or maybe you've noticed some in your coworkers. Next slide, please. So we can talk about secondary traumatic stress and burnout, but there's another type of stress. It's called organizational stress. The workplace setting is a very important predictor of STS, right? Unsupportive work environments have a powerful influence, but supportive work environments are just as powerful. So as an organization and as members of an organization, our goal is to think about how we can support our coworkers and support that environment to really create a safe psychological space where people can feel supported and even seek out assistance if they are in fact suffering from organizational stress, STS, or burnout. Next slide, please. So who is responsible for wellness at your work? It's you, your coworkers, and your supervisors. We're going to start with the next slide, focusing on you first. Given that, next slide, please. Given that wellness at work is everyone's responsibility, it's important to expand your individual and organizational tools to include dealing with the impact of STS on organizational stress. So here are 7 domains to consider for bolstering wellness in the workplace. Okay? Having ways to reflect on compassion fatigue, building resilience, building and wellness practices, support systems outside of work, such as your family, loved ones, faith community, circle of friends, or your chosen family. And having a supportive work environment in the form of supportive coworkers, supervisors, and mentors. And for those of you who are seasoned in your jobs, having more experiences and time on the job is in itself a protective factor. And finally, reflective supervision is a promotive practice for those who have opportunity for formal supervision. If you don't have the opportunity for formal supervision, we recommend ways to engage in reflective practice later in this presentation. Next slide, please. So we'll begin with individual strategies that promote wellness at work. Traditionally, our understanding of self-care has been guided by the ABCs: awareness, balance, and connection. For awareness, building self-reflection skills and improving your ability to better understand stressful situations is very important. For balance, we want to think about inner balance that provides effective coping strategies. And then finally, we want to recognize the impact that trauma and STS can have on our connections with people. And so we want to build proactive and healthy connections with coworkers, supervisors, or even mental health professionals to ensure that we stay healthy as possible. Let's talk about building awareness with the next slide. So building awareness is really how we look at things, right? So we can reflect on how we're feeling, knowing that the work that we do could be impacting us, knowing that we have patterns of what increases our emotional reactivity to situations, including positive emotions. And the acceptance piece is moving away from any type of should nots. So I shouldn't be feeling this way, I'm a professional, and accepting that it's okay to be impacted by stress and trauma, but that we have to practice that self-compassion. And so if we understand what's going on with ourselves and we have acceptance for the way things are, that will build the stage for what to do and how to improve our stress management. So let's talk about focusing awareness. So let's begin with a little bit of a self-assessment. What are the ways that your body is impacted by stress? Where do you feel it? How does your body react? So for me, I might feel some pain in my joints right away. For other people, it could be like heartburn or difficulty breathing. How might stress impact my personal life? Like for me, I know right away, as soon as I'm starting to be short with my loved ones, it's a good time to really beef up that self-care. And then how does stress impact your professional life? So you could maybe see yourself being less productive at work, or your mind wandering, or maybe becoming fixated on a problem or negative situations. Next slide, please. So let's talk about repacking that invisible suitcase. Because of the work we do, we might have some unhelpful ways of looking at the world in that suitcase. Let's replace them with more helpful ways. One way to do that is through appraisal. That is, how do we define what's happening to us? I like to call this reframe, right? So we can look at a situation as negative. We could look at it as positive. It's mostly helpful to look at it balanced, right? So maybe if your first thought is, oh, things just never work out. A more helpful thought might be, hey, I can find another way. Sometimes things work out. I need to keep trying. So reframing how you see things in a more helpful light is important. And that's what we could fill our suitcases with. We also want to fill our suitcases with that sense of self-efficacy, how we think about our ability to do the job well. And that can come from optimism, right? So people who are optimistic, they kind of have the skill of focusing on the positive without denying the negative and channeling one energy towards what is controllable. So optimism is about identifying what is going well without ignoring the negative, and also trying to figure out what is within my control and what is not. Next slide, please. So another way of ongoing wellness is to seek balance. Okay? When we discuss balance, we're referring to both outer balance and inner balance. Outer balance refers to balancing activities in your life, including work, personal and family life, rest, and leisure. Whereas inner balance involves being able to effectively recharge yourself and find inner peace and meaning despite challenges that surround you. Next slide. So key step in gaining balance is figuring out how to regulate yourself when you feel out of control. And this is where we really want to employ some active coping strategies. An active coping strategy, an example, can include trying to resolve conflict with someone in an assertive manner, or removing a trigger or a reminder from the workplace when possible, or practicing mindfulness to keep oneself emotionally calm during stressful situations. It could be very in the moment strategies, like taking a deep breath. And it could also be those strategies that we use in the various realms that are on your screen, kind of as a lifestyle. We could also integrate vicarious resiliency. And that is really remembering when you made a difference in someone's life, even if it was a very small difference, or remembering the gains that you've helped initiate with others. That's vicarious resiliency. And it's an important tool in achieving balance. Let's talk about some other ways of achieving balance. That's the next slide. This is called the WTF protocol. Now, it might not be the typical WTF that your teenager texts you. It's a little bit different. It's walk, talk, and flesh it out. Okay. So there's a saying that the body keeps the score. So stress is a very physiological response. So if we walk it out, that's going to be helpful. And if we talk it out, and we could actually even do a walk and talk together, walking or talking with your friends or coworkers and flushing it out. So drinking plenty of fluids. Now, if we were to practice this, I'll give you a little bit of a homework assignment. And sometime today, I'd like for you to practice walking and talking. So maybe it's a loved one or a coworker. Take a little walk and discuss what's one thing getting in the way of your ongoing wellness, and what's one thing that you're going to work on this week to improve your wellness. Next slide, please. So if I could ask everyone just to close your eyes for a minute. I would really like for you to think about a rewarding moment at your job. Maybe it's a time you felt like you really made a difference. Or maybe it's a time that you were able to do something that you didn't think you were capable of. Maybe it's when you received a warm wish of gratitude from a youth or a coworker. I really want you to picture it in your mind. What was going on? What were some of the people around you? What do you see and what do you hear? What's the feeling that you have inside? Really putting yourself back at this very rewarding moment. So if you've had it, after you've had a chance to think about this rewarding moment, I could draw your attention back to the screen. Because what really increases compassion, satisfaction, and vicarious resiliency is that ability to think about what makes us do what we do. What are the reasons? Why do we continue to go to this job every day? There's some other questions on your screen that you might find helpful. Maybe you're able to take the time to write these down just to kind of have a tool in your toolbox, that reminder as to why you do go to work. So what are 3 things that you love and enjoy about your job? I'm going to jot that down. I'm going to write down 5 people whose lives you've really touched. Jot down why it is that you took your current job. And what are 3 compliments you've received from your coworkers or 3 things you think you do well? Taking time to reflect on what we do well and rewarding moments at our job are very, just very important exercises. So often we can remember things that didn't go so well or ways that we've disappointed ourselves or others. But in order to keep going and doing what we do, we need to remember those moments that made a difference. Next slide, please. So this is a slide to remind you that connection is very important. So often when we are feeling down or we're struggling, sometimes we might have a tendency to self-isolate when really what we need to do is to connect with others. So even when you're not feeling like it, this is a time I would encourage you to go forward with the family game night or go on a date or get out and get active, because connection is one of the strongest resiliency factors. Next slide, please. And next slide. Okay, so while you're at work, it's important to practice reflective practice. And I just want to make a distinction, and I know I'm running out of time a little bit here. So the distinction I want to make is there's a difference between just venting about your job and reflective practice. So venting tends to be a little bit more about ruminating, discussing details, and it's emotionally charged. When we share the details with others, we kind of put them at risk of vicarious trauma. And sometimes it's not overly helpful for us either. So we recommend reflective practice, right? So we want to, if we're going to do this with our coworkers, we want to find a private spot where there's no youth, ask their permission to share your experiences, and you focus on experiences. So reflective practice is asking questions or sharing what was going on with me emotionally when this happened, not necessarily the ins and outs, but what my reaction was. How was I feeling? Why was I processing it that way? Could it be a reminder of a previous experience I had? So it's very much about the reaction to the event versus the specifics of the event. Next slide, please. And let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so quickly, foundations for trauma-informed organizations. To kind of help us determine like how well we're doing and whether or not we're employing some of these reflective practices, we can think about those awareness, the assessments, and within the resources, I noticed that there's the NCTSN Trauma-Informed Juvenile Court Self-Assessment, which is an important resource that can kind of help your organization take their temperature as to how well they're doing in providing support for their staff. Another way to provide support for staff is through supervision. That's the next slide. And so I'm going to go over this briefly because another resource that you can access are the core competencies for supervision and support. And that resource is available on the National Child Traumatic Stress Network website. This is just a very brief overview, but reflective supervision is that supervision that really encourages the supervisee to talk about their experience and utilize reflective practice. And that's the slide that we just went over a few moments ago. So this, we'll go ahead and take this to my last slide, I believe. Next, please, so we could wrap up. Next slide. So how do you find time for workplace wellness, right? A lot of what we talked about might seem kind of daunting, but we wanted to end by just reminding you that often it doesn't take a lot of time to practice wellness in the workplace. If you have 2 minutes, you could take a deep breath. If you have 5 minutes, you might decide to clean up a common area. If you had 10 minutes, maybe that's enough time to plan a celebration. Or if you have 30 minutes, maybe you could go take some time and eat lunch with your colleagues. So to make it personal, I want you to just really kind of be able to look at this list and see what you could do in your workplace, even if you just had a short time. Okay, and that will take us to the end.
Deb, we don't have any questions. And we're up to 5 minutes to the end, and we have a few slides to cover. Just want to encourage everyone that if you have questions, please write them down. We have a panel made up of staff from the National Native Children's Trauma Center on Friday, and we can answer questions then.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And for
this is Marilyn. I just want to remind everyone that, anyone that if you're interested in receiving TTA from the National Native Children's Trauma Center, please go to the www.tyrc.org, tribalyouth.org center, and our website can be found there. And you can also ask for TTA through that website. Thank you, everyone, for being with us this afternoon.
Next slide. So thank you everyone for attending B2 session, Building an Indigenous Resilience Focus Lens. As a reminder, let me do it right now. I am putting your evaluation link in the chat box. Please, if you could take a moment to complete the evaluation, as it will help us to improve our next trainings for our grantees and our relatives working in Indian country. And there is also a sign in the conference lobby that will link you to session evaluations in the, that if you didn't fill them out for yesterday or maybe this morning, if you could go back and fill out those evaluations again, it's greatly appreciated and it helps us to know how to serve you better. One last note, if you have been unable to join a session that you are interested in, There will be a recording posted on this platform, and it will remain up until April 30th, 2021. And then after this time, you will find all the conference materials at our Tribal Youth Resource website, tribalyouth.org. And just for a reminder, if anyone's spirit needs some support, please visit the healing room. You can smudge off, there's music, there's resources, and we have a relative there to help speak with you and support your spirit to move through the rest of your day. Thank you, Marilyn, and thank you, Deb. Next slide, please.